Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
Hello and welcome to the Second Reading Podcast for the second week of June. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm joined again today by Josh Blank, Research Director of the Texas Politics Project. Josh, how are we this week?
Doing better than last week, I guess.
Yeah, last week was tough.
Yeah.
So that's good. I think hopefully most everybody is. Well, for today, attention in the nation and the state continues to be focused on the protests that were triggered by the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Now 2 weeks ago, more than 2 weeks ago, his funeral was held this week in Houston, his hometown. Attention, for better or worse, is turning to the political response as the protests have continued but become more consistently peaceful, I think. The system has, as it should to some degree, turned to the political and the policy response and to try to come up with some kind of answer, maybe answer is the wrong word, to what's been happening in the last 2 weeks. It's complicated to say the least because we're talking about multiple discussions, a lot going on. And so, when you're trying to come up as an elected official with what we're calling answers, but you don't really know exactly what the question to focus on is.
I don't know if answers are maybe response. Maybe it's not necessarily
I
answer.
think I'd said response and I didn't want to use it again, but some kind of response is really what we're talking about. I mean, we thought today what we do is talk about two of the major themes that are going on here. And again, there's a lot at play here, both in the national conversation, and it actually even looks different in different places, depending on what the responses, the protests look like and what's been going on at the local and state level. But today we want to talk about what's playing out both nationally in Texas and talk about race and talk about policing. I mean, this initially arose, of course, because of the killing of George Floyd by Minnesota police. But the police response to those protests in many parts of the country, perhaps most prominently in the last week in the nation's capital in Washington, D.C., has further fueled this discussion. The discussion has been rooted in race and in the history of police practices in communities of color, especially Black communities. And these are problems with deep historical roots. They go back really to the end of the Civil War and the efforts of local governments in most parts of the country to segregate and control formerly enslaved people through the era of Jim Crow laws in the South, through the civil rights movement that peaked in the mid-1960s, through the mass incarcerations, then the war on drugs that hit Black communities hard starting in the 1980s and really running into the present. And we could look at lots of details within each of those. That's a very broad constitution of the arc here. So I thought we'd start with policing. That seems like the first most immediate topic. Now, at the intersection of race and the criminal justice system, the discussion right now looks like, it's turning into the most fundamental confrontation with how policing is practiced that we've seen in a very long time in this country, certainly since the last wave of professionalizing crime fighting in the mid-20th century. Now, we've seen recurring discussions of police brutality, but it seems to me we're having now a much more detailed, broad public policy discussion about how policing should happen and to some extent what the police should even be.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, one of the interesting things is to the extent that we've had discussions about police policy, really, I mean, in the recent history. So, thinking about the last 40 or 50 years, it's really been mostly focused on how to make sure that police are supported enough. And that includes both, payment, pensions, benefits, but also weapons, right? And resources. And so most of the discussions around, especially the political discussions around police have been about how to provide them with more resources to combat, increasingly terrifying, threats and different types of crime, whether it be drugs or otherwise, but usually drugs. I mean, you already highlighted that, and the war on drugs is a big impetus for this. I mean, this is a very, very different discussion. And what's interesting about it is, and I think, it's partially the fact that, you do have all these politicians searching for a response to this, and they're searching for different responses depending on kind of their orientations toward these questions. But it's ranging from, things that are, I would say is, I'm going to put this in quote, in quotes, as simple as banning chokeholds, for example, just some literal, how police conduct their jobs, but all the way back to, really thinking, I mean, you kind of mentioned this about how are police oriented in society? I mean, I think other, people have pointed this out many times, but for many citizens of society, the police are your primary interaction point with the government. I mean, this is basically, you're not really usually talking to a city council member. If anything, you talk to police officers. This is kind of, and the question becomes, what is the role of police in society? And what people are saying when they're talking about that is they're talking about, should police be our frontline mental health responders? Should they be the people who are dealing with homelessness? Should they be the people who are the primary, let's say, state resource in dealing with domestic abuse and in some case child abuse and drug addiction and all these sorts of societal ills? And I think right now what's interesting is, again, the range of this discussion can go all the way from, we need to make sure that there's better hiring practices for police officers, or police officers shouldn't be allowed to use chokeholds, all the way to, what are we even asking police to do right now? And that's a big discussion, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the last kind of uptick that we saw in this was, very much, really in the mid to late 90s when we saw the emergence of, what was called community policing disseminate throughout to police departments throughout the country. And, whenever you get these big ideas kind of emerging like that, and the community policing model was about trying to engage more ties to the community. Police departments in some ways embraced it because it was accompanied by a push for more hiring, and in a lot of places making police forces bigger. And
I was going to say, wasn't that discussion on the heels of basically a huge increase in the number of cops? I mean, wasn't that?
Yeah, and I think it's important, particularly given the partisan environment, that was pushed at the national level by a Democratic president. It was Bill Clinton who made it a centerpiece of his campaign, and then his policy position in this area to continually go before Congress and push the phrase, we're going to put 100,000 new cops in the street. Mm-hmm. And if you look at some of the recent, collections of clips that are being put together by, virtually everybody that's now reviewing this history, it was something that was in the State of the Union speech 4 or 5 times. And in the end, he wound up getting more than that as part of this model of, that was kind of in a way, a kinder, gentler, it were marketed as a kinder, gentler police, even as it was also accompanied by the war on drugs and a crime legislation that was extremely punitive of people, for drug possession. Many things that were now at the national level and in the states kind of reviewing and trying to unwind to some degree, particularly the heavy sentences for drug possession, which were themselves criticized for being racially discriminatory.
Well, and I think, that in and of itself really is a great encapsulate. I mean, it's been 30 years, so it's not like this is an immediate shift, right? But it's
Seems
a great
like yesterday to me. Yeah.
Well, that's fair. It's 5 years ago now. But I mean, it's one of those things where, that actually encapsulates how far this discussion has come, even in such a short period of time. Because if you think about that, what we're saying here is, right now it may seem as though, Democrats, progressives, and sort of, their allies are pushing for some of the bigger, large scale reforms. I think Republicans have been much more open to some of these more narrowly focused reforms in policing. But the point here is, you go back to the 90s, which we're talking about here, when Bill Clinton sort of spearheaded a big increase in the number of police officers, the size of police departments, and again, a continued trajectory of the war on drugs. What that shows you is that, the idea of being tough on crime and supporting police officers, was an unquestioned tenet of politics at that period. And it really has been, honestly, I would say up until the last, 5 to 7 years. And when I say that, I don't mean accepted by everybody, as the data clearly shows, but accepted by majorities in both parties, that, you can't be a politician who appears to be, they would say, you can't appear to be quote unquote soft on crime.
Right.
And so ultimately, the fact that we're even beginning to have these discussions, and the fact that there are mainstream politicians and parties who are pushing for, potentially saying, hey, maybe these police forces are getting too big, that's a big shift in the policy space.
Yeah, it is. I mean, and I think it's one of the reasons I raised Clinton. You're right to notice that became a way for Democrats, frankly, to look less liberal.
Yeah.
This was an area where centrist Democrats, particularly centrist white Democrats, but also other, Democrats of other races, frankly, were able to say, we are not just, quote unquote, soft liberals. We think that we need to have a police in the community, but it's how we're going to do this that has to change. But we're not, as you say, we're not soft on crime. And that's been, under some reevaluation in the last several years. But this is certainly, the events of the last 2 weeks have certainly accelerated that. And there are a bunch of, kind of significant policy questions then that have been opened up that, are typically, have been bubbling under and are always going on in a lot of ways at local, at the local level, which is where, all of this police enforcement and all the administration and institutionalization of policing happens. And that's an important piece of this, that it's a national conversation that has thousands of local versions and in which a lot of the power and decision-making and influencing is going to unfold at the local level.
I think people, who are following this for the first time might be surprised, even in a federal system, how disaggregated the management of police forces are across this country. I mean, I think, the idea, you can see this on both sides, right? I mean, the idea that, either the president himself can, order local police forces to do something, or, not really true. The idea that, Congress could pass legislation that would immediately impact every, police force in the country? Not really. I mean, they can try to compel them to, but not so much. And I think, here locally in Austin, I think something people would be surprised to find out is the fact that, the city council has no control over who the police chief is. There's a lot of discussion right now about the police chief in Austin, whether or not he should resign or not, based on, how the departments responded to the protests, but also previous controversies. The reality is the Austin City Council, the mayor, the elected officials of Austin actually have no control over who the police chief is here. It's up to the city manager. And in fact, it would actually be a violation of some of the charter if they were to even press too hard on an employment decision like that. And something like that may be surprising to people, but this is actually kind of more the state of play than not, which is why in some ways, I would say, I'm just thinking about this now, but the public opinion pressure is so important in this, because this isn't necessarily about, politicians looking to, capitalize on discontent to reform police departments. This is about, mass protests that have been going on for weeks now, and how not only are elected officials going to respond to that, but also, largely autonomous police forces, who rely on public support to some degree to maintain their legitimacy. I mean, just to be fair about it.
Yeah, and I think this if, we don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but if you look back at kind of the history of policing and thinking about policing and what these models should be, there's this recurring discussion of how police departments can retain legitimacy from within people that are kind of trying to be thought leaders in that intellectual and professional community. But a lot of these issues are just very, put it this way, until atmospheres get heated like it is now, or incidents really draw people's attention to it, these are very kind of mundane government, and administrative issues. What kind of oversight should be exercised over police departments, which, as you say, have a lot of autonomy?
Right. And is it internal? Is it external? Is it elected officials? Is it a citizens council? I mean, these are all, and it depends.
Yeah. How are police trained? Where do the norms and guidelines for training come from? How should police be equipped? Which really goes to this discussion has informed this recent discussion of the militarization of police. There's been a lot of attention to, the public profile police and the protests, the equipment they have, the equipment they use. And as always in politics, the quantity of the resources that go to police and for what purposes and how they are allocated and how much control you can have over them. And so we're going to see these conversations and these issues that, if you follow local and city politics at all, I mean, these are always kind of bubbling under. Every budget year, there's a discussion of, the chunk of the budget that goes to the police. There are these personnel issues like you're talking about. There's the role of police unions. And these are all things that Congress doesn't really have much to do with. And so all of that you have to take, I think, as the backdrop in this for where the conversation is now and thinking about two developments in the last couple of weeks. One is the emergence of the slogan, defund the police, which has become kind of the umbrella concept of, be very mundane about it, that is now coming out of these protest movements. It's coming out of, to some degree, Black Lives Matter, but also just the general kind of wave of protest that's going on. So that's one thing, is just to fund the police, and I want to come back on this second. But then the other thing is that there has been national political action, and that Congress this week, the Democrats in the House, unveiled a police reform bill, and the word is that the Republicans in the Senate are working on it. But let's talk a little bit about defund the police first. I mean, it's a vague term, and I think it's lent itself almost immediately to become kind of a political Rorschach test for how you look at this in terms of how literally you take that term. I frankly think it's an unfortunate artifact of them choosing that language. But
I was going to say, the problem is it's not a vague term. It's a vague description of a general bucket of policies that is still being defined. As a term, it's actually almost too clear.
Maybe
and
it's not vague enough. Yeah.
Well, right. Because ultimately, I mean, people, if you say, do you think we should defund the police department, whether you know what that refers to or not, first of all, it doesn't mean anything specific right now in terms of the people who are pushing for defunding the police per se. And it depends, again, on just as this conversation should make clear, it really depends on the locality in terms of what that might actually mean. But for people who don't know what it means taking basically, what if we didn't have a police force? Now, that's not what anybody's proposing. But the idea here is, and we already kind of discussed this a little bit, is, I mean, what it generally means is a reallocation of responsibilities and resources towards issues like mental health, homelessness, drug addiction, domestic violence, basically from police agencies to social welfare agencies to either address these causes as, these issues as they happen, or to direct some more of those resources to the root causes of those problems. And so that's, what people are talking about is basically a shift from basically funding, what people would broadly call public safety budgets to basically social welfare budgets to deal with things that, again, if you talk to police, I've in various things I've done, I've talked to the head of the police union here in Austin. They, in their positions, they don't want to be dealing with mental health issues. They don't want to be first responders for mental health. And this goes back to the fact that, as we we're kind of discussing, training all across the country is very different for police officers. There's no standard training. How much they're trained to actually deal with mental health, homelessness, domestic violence, it's going to be limited no matter what. And it's not necessarily something that the police departments even want to be doing. But this is a complicated discussion, whereas saying defund the police is not. And it doesn't, and it really actually, hides a lot of the complexity in this issue. One thing I just want to jump back to before we keep going on that, though, is, you mentioned something I think is interesting here, which is, one of the things I think makes, Texas a particularly interesting case around these ideas in terms of defunding the police is the fact that because Texas is a traditionally conservative state, what you tend to have is small, basically small government. And what that means is, low taxes, low services is the model we talk about here. But one of the essential services that all Texas government provides, whether at the state level or the local levels, is public safety services. And so one of the things that's, I think, interesting about this is that, I read yesterday that when they talk about defunding the New York City police budget, for instance, they're talking about 6% of the city's budget. In a place like Austin, public safety, including fire, EMS, and police, and the majority of this is police, is about a little more than 50 to 60% of the actual city budget. And so that's a reflection of, again, different political priorities. New York City, very liberal in a more liberal state, is going to have a lot more social programs that they're already putting money towards. In a place like Austin, in a state like Texas, which again expects a lot less from government generally, turns out that public safety is a much bigger share of our budget. The political intersection of this is interesting in that you've got these Democratic cities in a Republican state who, having limited resources themselves, might actually be open to shifting their budgets from public safety to social welfare programs. And that's sort of something that's kind of underlying the surface here, which actually, in Texas it might make it even more important in some ways, or more pressing of an issue. I'm not sure. We'll see.
Well, and public opinion in Texas is an interesting template for this, right? So, we polled on that last year. Most recently, we've done it a couple times where we have people assess, how favorably they view different institutions. And the police actually don't do very bad overall, but there's a lot of internal differences depending on your racial group.
Right. So, overall in Texas, we found that 58% of Texas voters in 2019 said they had a favorable view of the police, but that hides a lot of differences. So 58% of people overall had a favorable view of the police, but that was 78% of Republicans and 39% of Democrats. More pressing to the point here, 67% of white Texas voters had a favorable view of the police compared to only 32% of African-American Texas voters. And the police was actually relatively highly rated in terms of institutions. The military was slightly high, was rated slightly higher. Texas state government, local government was rated lower than that. The criminal justice system overall was rated positively by only 35% of Texans. And that actually shows you something. I think, it's interesting given that these are related, right? The way, police on the one hand and the criminal justice system on the other. What you see with the criminal justice system is you see the ratings of an institutional part of society, but it's one that we've been having a discussion about now for at least 10 or 15 years with respect to reforms to the criminal justice system to make it more fair. And people are aware of that. And so it's not as though the criminal justice system is super highly rated, given the fact that we've had a lot of discussions about the inequities in the system, and those have been ongoing for a long time. But the police thing is, police are generally well rated by most Texans, if not necessarily by African Americans.
Yeah, and I think when we look at those numbers, it tells us something about where this debate may go, I suspect. And we're already beginning to see this, that, there is, partisanship and the way that and the demographics of the two political parties in the country are going to shape this discussion. We're seeing it already. I think, people listening to this are probably seeing it among themselves, in their families, in which people are viewing how this is unfolding now very differently, and it has a lot to do with your predispositions in this area.
That's right. But also, I think what's interesting, and I think, we were sort of having a conversation before this about, is this a watershed moment? Is this the time we look back on and say, hey, this is when things changed? And, I think in general, but especially for young people, it's disappointing how rarely that's the case. Most often something seems like it's going to be a big change, and then, either inattention or, the sort of the slow gears of government grind to a halt, and then nothing happens. I think the thing, and I think that's an open question to see where we go from here. But I think what is interesting is, and as you start to look at some of the national public opinion polls, I think one of the differences that we're seeing now is that there's more agreement on the underlying problem. Not total agreement. Let's be clear here. There's not total agreement on the underlying problem. But, even if you look at public opinion from even just a few years ago to today, the share of Americans, white, black, Hispanic, otherwise, who say that, basically police officers discriminate against, black people or treat black people differently than white people has gone up significantly. Now, often that can just be the result of the shock, right? So right now you're seeing it on the news every day. People are aware of it. But the thing is that we've had incidents like this before. We've had police, kill African Americans in their custody before, on video before. We've had protests in response to that before. The difference now is that, having seen, it seems like multiple of these incidents over a number of the last 5 or 10 years with, the prevalence of cell phone videos, but then also I think how sustained these protests have been. I mean, there's a question when they started, is this going to go on for one day? Is this going to be this weekend? Is it going to peter out? But it just keeps going, requiring some kind of response. And it seems like Americans as a whole are coming around to the fact that, African Americans are not being treated fairly by police officers. And that's something that's different because ultimately people did not agree with that on the whole, especially white Americans. For example, when Eric Garner was killed in much the same way as George Floyd.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question whether this is going to sustain or not. And we've seen this a lot in the last few years as politics have become both, polarized and volatile, and the parties have so sorted. And this does feel like a different moment in terms of, that the push for change seems to be not just, put it this way, a lot of these conversations in the last few years, and I would have to say guns is the comparison I would make in gun policy. There seems to be there's a sustained attention at the national level. Things happen sporadically in different parts of the country, but there's just not the kind of follow through. I mean, there's not been major gun legislation. We've just not seen a lot of things happen that people thought might happen over the last decade after a series of mass shootings. It feels like this is seeping down into politics throughout the country. I think in large part because of, as you say, because of race. And everywhere you look, this conversation is happening, and it's happening not just in the national media, but at the local level and at the state level. And it seems like the propagation of the discussion has happened in a way that we haven't seen with another political issue in a while. I mean, and it's taking a bunch of different forms, and that's why it is about both, and it's both the intersection of race and policing is really, I mean, as we recorded this podcast this morning, I was watching a commissioner's court meeting in Caldwell County here outside of Austin over Confederate monuments. And it was an extensive, heartfelt discussion that it's hard for me to watch that in, basically rural Caldwell County and think that this was just something that's going to come up in the commissioner's court. And remember, commissioner's court is sort of like the analogous thing. It's not a court. It's not a court of law. It's a governing body for the county. This is not going to go away. This is not just somebody showing up for a council meeting, speaking their piece about a pet cause, and then it's going to go away. There's heat, there's excitement, and they got the attention of the court. And we're seeing that all over the place. I mean, there's already proposals in Austin, about this, as we've mentioned before, at the national level, even though they don't have much impact at the local level. Congressional Democrats and probably as in response, Senate Republicans, and I think Mitt Romney will probably be involved in this bill, are going to call for shifts in federal policy that can only affect directly federal law enforcement practices, but are calling for some of the similar things. And in a way, it's a way of signaling, of modeling behavior, I think, and sending signals to the local level. So it does feel like there is something more sustained going on. How fast that can happen, how much finally comes out of it, I think, as we've been saying, remains to be seen.
Yeah. I mean, I think, the thing that really strikes me about all this that is so, despite the heartbreaking nature of everything that we're talking about here and the complexity of it all, I mean, in the present moment, I think the thing that's just so amazing about this is just the role that media has played in all this. And I don't necessarily mean, the mainstream media. I just mean the idea of media, people taking videos, people showing what it's like to protest, because that makes a difference. I mean, I think ultimately, this conversation was very different 5 years ago. I mean, there were videos of police officers, killing unarmed black men that we've seen. We've seen these videos before, and they're heartbreaking and they're tragic. But the response, even again 4 years ago was, hey, that's one bad apple. The rest of police are good, and we can't judge all police by this one bad apple. The problem then becomes, well, first of all, how many bad apples are you willing to accept? But, I think what you've seen in the last few weeks is you've seen numerous videos emerge in a similar span of time showing either police officers or just armed white civilians in some case killing African-American men. But then additionally, when people have protested this, basically police violence, and it's being met by, in some cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, by unrestrained police violence that is then videotaped by people, it becomes really, really difficult for anyone, no matter what their predispositions, no matter how they're oriented towards police, to say, this is okay. And that's kind of where we are now. But again, follow through is a lot harder. And, again, a political system, both in Texas and elsewhere, that's not necessarily made to move quickly, and certainly isn't made to, move in extreme directions quickly.
Yeah, and I think as we wind down, I mean, for me, there's an interesting combination of, two elements that we think of in politics all the time, that are, kind of a intention and also just very different when it comes to people that don't normally pay attention to politics, all of a sudden paying attention to politics. On one hand, I just think there's no way right now that you can ignore the importance of sustained protest in this. And, I think, you raise a really important point that part of the thing about that protest is not only its duration. I mean, we've had 2 weeks and counting of protests, with more violent and a much more kind of chaotic feel in the earlier period, now settling more into a more peaceful, organized, sustained, kind of, with the big marches that are still continuing in the system. But with the overlay of all of the micro level media and personally produced media that are really kind of adding a layer to this that I think is both giving the public a different view of it, but also sustaining it in some ways, I think. And on the other hand, you've got, the very mundane institutional dynamic going on in which, this is going to be a, sustained series of teachable moments, not just in social protests, but in decentralized institutional response. And what I mean by that is, we are going to see federalism in the United States and the way that federalism shapes policy and politics in the United States really play out here for the next, months, if not years, on this issues, as the different levels of the political system, the national government, state governments, and then all of these thousands of local governments try to respond to this without anybody institutionally in the driver's seat. There are people that can be thought leaders. There are people that can model behavior. There are people that can try to drive the discussion, but no one's going to be in charge of this, and no one's going to have the final say because of the federal arrangements in the country. So I think with that, we're going to try to keep this in the window. Thanks, Josh. Thanks to our sound crew, and everybody have a safe and healthy week. And we'll be back next week with another edition of Second Reading. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.